Have you ever thought about how the American mainstream media frames stories and what effects that can have on the public?
William A. Gampson describes a frame as a central organizing idea for making sense of relevant events that suggest what the issue is. Frames are interpretive clues for neutral facts that define problems, diagnose causes, and suggest solutions. My name is Nicole Cummings.
My name is Alejandra Caballero.
And my name is John Twasson. Today we will be using content, comparative, and rhetorical framing analysis to examine how the American mainstream media has framed the UN's resolution for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza that was passed on March 25th of 2024, and how it has been perceived by the public.
This resolution was historic because the U.S. abstained from the vote instead of vetoing it.
54/254. Please raise their hand. Those against. Abstention. The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 0 vote against, 1 abstention.
We collected news stories from various American mainstream media sources like CNN, ABC, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and NPR. For our comparative analysis, we also looked at the Times of Israel's coverage of the story to determine how the American mainstream media has framed this story. We began by analyzing the agenda setting and the agenda extension used by these sources. We analyzed how our chosen sources have framed this story by examining the titles, abstracts, and the amount of coverage shown by each of these outlets. We began by looking at the embedded sources coverage of the story first, which is the source that gets the first-hand account of what unfolded. For us, this source is the United Nations. We noticed that the UN's coverage omitted the US's impact on the passing of the resolution and the use of the word demanding in the title.
We compared this, supposedly unbiased, source to frames that we saw in the American mainstream media coverage, beginning with NPR and the Associated Press. We noticed that, in comparison to the UN's coverage, NPR's frames focused more on the relationship between the US and Israel, and the Associated Press's frames focused more on Israel's offensive push into Rafah, which was scheduled by the IDF and rose global alarm. We used comparative analysis to examine how more widely consumed American mainstream media has framed this story to see how journalistic framing has shifted.
By looking at CNN and the Washington Post coverage of this story, we noticed a shift in the focus to the US's abstention and its impacts on the ongoing war in Gaza.
Next, we spoke with an expert who was able to back up our observations of our framing analysis.
Hi, I'm Megan Duncan. I'm assistant professor in the School of Communication, and I am in the Journalism and Multimedia Division.
So how would you describe a journalistic frame, and do you think studying frame is important?
Yes, a journalistic frame is extremely important because the purpose of journalism is to help citizens make the decisions they need to in a self-governing democracy. So every day we need information about what's going on in the world around us to help us decide what's important, what we should pay attention to, and to give us a direction to help us understand how the world's working. But we can't tell people everything. We just can't. There's too much going on in the world. And again, the purpose is to get people efficiently the information they need to make those decisions. So when I'm constructing a journalism story, I take the picture of what the most important parts are to you.
So where would you say that you get most of your news from?
I'm still a little old school in that I have my Twitter lists that have been curated. I joined Twitter early on, and as much as the service has degraded, it's still the best way for me to get news. I'm also, just like so many other people, the Google News that pops up when I open my browser on my phone, Google does a great job of predicting that I want some pro wrestling news that day.
So did you hear about the UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza on March 25th, 2024?
Yes.
Based on the title of these news stories, do you think there's any bias, and which way do you think these news stories lean?
So I think the premise of your question suggests that there is a reality of bias, especially on hard topics like the conflict in Israel-Palestine. Bias is a perception. It's not a reality. So there's a media theory that actually goes back to this specific conflict that it was developed about, the hostile media effect. This says that two people can read the exact same story, headline. When they have differing opinions, they'll both find that exact same headline, story, biased against their side. Bias is just a perception that we all feel based on what prior knowledge, what prior emotions we have. Bias isn't something that can be anchored in reality. So saying, does a specific headline have bias? The headline emphasizes certain topics, it emphasizes certain parties in a conflict or ways of thinking about it, but that doesn't make it biased. There's so many parts of a decision that go into crafting a headline, from where it's going to appeal, what your audience is. That of course is not purely objective, because that is impossible. Of course there's decisions that went into it, but saying it's biased toward one side or biased towards another isn't an empirical question that we can answer.
How would you describe the framing used in the title of this United Nations news story?
They use a common tactic we use in journalism, where we put a noun at the top and then a colon. Sometimes we use that when we're trying to let you know somebody said something. Here it's letting you know, here's the main topic. So in here they are emphasizing that the topic is Gaza, right? They're not emphasizing what the UN did. They're not emphasizing anybody's particular opinion on it. They're just letting you know that that's the topic.
How would you describe the framing used by CNN and Washington Post in these news stories?
We ended up with another question in the CNN one. And I think that that can be viewed as a way to say almost neutral in a tough topic, right? If we are just posing a question, it's really hard for somebody to be like, you've done something wrong, or I feel that there's bias in your story. But I would encourage them to do the hard work to distill the story into the quick facts that we need. And again, we see a lot of US emphasized in both of those. Again, it makes sense because we're a US audience and you're trying to inform the US audience of how an international story is going to impact the audience at home.
Next, we went out into the campus of Virginia Tech to ask students and professors how they perceive these frames based solely on the headlines.
Did you hear about the UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire on March 25th?
I did not.
Not really, no.
No.
I did not.
I didn't.
So I've heard about it, honestly, in terms of seeing anything on the news, though, beyond just headlines, I've not.
So basically on March 25th, the United Nations Security Council voted 14-0 in favor of a resolution demanding a ceasefire in Gaza for the rest of Ramadan. The United States abstained from the vote for the first time, which allowed the measure to pass. It's like, where do you get most of your news from?
Ever since I left home and I stopped having the news on the TV, it's low-key been from just news outlets. I mean online, like a TikTok, Instagram reel, or something my friends tells me.
I usually get most of my news just from headlines, things like that. I try to cross-reference sources, so I usually try to subscribe to BBC, things like that, to try to get more world news, and then big news anchors like Fox News, but also CNN, to kind of try to cross and create my own opinion, because I feel like no matter what news source you go after, it's going to be biased in some way.
I would say social media, and then just general Googling of a topic, and then just kind of the first couple results after that Google search.
I'm not really proud of this, but TikTok and Instagram, I think those are my main sources, because I'm on it constantly and I don't really seek to find any other ways to get their information.
Typically NPR, CNN, TikTok, Apple.
I guess social media. Sometimes I look on New York Times.
I would say
know those little Apple News like notifications that pop up on your phone? That's where I get my news, and then also shows social media, just like scrolling on Instagram or something.
So from Bloomberg, specifically the Bloomberg app on my phone.
Based on the title of these news stories, do you think there's any bias in them? Which way do you think they lean? So the first example is U.S. non-vetoed at UN. Netanyahu's response reflects an alliance in crisis, a war slowed.
I'm not quite sure. I feel like B doesn't have that much bias because like it's just a question. C, I don't know, maybe a little bit, but I'm not really seeing much. And A is just like overly dramatic. So
it's gonna be 2 or 3. I would say probably. I would say probably 3 would be my take on it in terms of which one is the most biased. It's hard because just the term bias has this negative connotation to it immediately. But if I'm going to operationalize bias as being something where there's a strong opinion that's injected into it, I would say 3, right?
I'd say maybe the third one seems the most biased, just by the wording, like it's too late for many in Gaza, but I don't even know if that's explicitly biased, more just opinion. So was there another part to the question?
Which one do you read?
Which one would I click on? Probably the second one, because it's a very like, what does that mean for the war? It's pretty broad, so yeah.
And on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would you say you trust like the U.S. mainstream media?
Just like in general, like all of it as a whole?
And like Fox, like just all of it.
I think like the key words about like non-veto and alliance and crisis, I think that those words like they're very like kind of like buzzwords, if you will, and I think it draws the reader into looking into the article more, which I think is a really important thing. I think for the second one, kind of talking about like, again, with the big words like ceasefire, resolution to pass, I think it also talks about the like concept of, do we want, from a defense standpoint, America to be involved in other wars, or do we want it more or less to kind of keep our hands off? And I think that that's something that just comes down to the elected officials that we choose.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bias. They're all trying to kind of frame the U.S.'s decision for a ceasefire. They're kind of implying their own. Whoever's writing it is making their own reasoning for that decision for abstaining from the vote. So yeah, I do think there's bias for sure.
I'd say the first one is probably the most opinionated or most biased.
On a scale of 1 through 10, how much do you trust American mainstream media when it comes to foreign affairs?
like I trust them to like give me like facts, but I wouldn't base an opinion off of that. It's like I feel like they're pretty like heavily opinionated. The reporters and whatnot, they have like a lot of emotion when they're talking about it. So.
Like a 5. I'd say maybe a solid 8. I feel like I am pretty trustworthy in general, but also there always is a little bit of like, oh, I don't really know.
I don't trust any mainstream media, so in any country that I've been to.
Not that much, honestly, because I think like, yeah, like it can be very biased if it's not coming from like their point of view, and obviously like we don't know what's going on in that area of the world, so I think like if it's coming from like the US streamline, then like I don't really trust that much. Yeah.
I think I used to trust BBC a little bit more, but I used to be on the news all the time, right? So I used to be a correspondent for Fox, for Al Jazeera, I was on CNN a bunch. So it's like, it's one of these things where obviously the questions get framed in different ways, and I always enjoy being on the news solely because it is, when I say it's a challenge, you never know. You know what you're going to be talking about because they give you a sense, right? You're going to be talking about this particular thing, but you do not know in the moment what they're going to ask you or what any of the follow-ups are going to be.
The framing of headlines is where journalistic frames impact engagement the most.
There's a fine line between biased framing and objective reporting that journalists and reporters strive to find.
Framing doesn't only tell people what to think about about, it can also increase engagement with the news story.